This is Newsmax TV. I'm Ashley Martella. You've seen polls asking if the country is headed in the right direction, seemingly always with negative results. Well, let's get a different perspective now from someone on the outside looking in. Daniel Hannan is a member of the European Parliament representing Southeast England for the Conservative Party. He is also the Secretary General of the Alliance of European Conservatives and Reformists. He's written the book entitled The New Road to Serfdom, a letter of warning to America. Welcome to Newsmax, Daniel.
Thank you.
In your book, you say that while you love your native England, the country has gone completely in the wrong direction with government control, out-of-control spending, socialized medicine, and so forth. And you see parallels now in the United States. Please explain what you consider to be the most egregious mistakes the U.S. is making.
Well, in a way, we've turned the corner in the United Kingdom. Having got ourselves into the sort of mess that you are also getting into here, we elected a different government that has now restored order and sanity to our public finances and has started balancing the books again. The administration here is really on its own in still pursuing the stimulus packages, the nationalizations, the regulation of private remuneration and so on. And here's my argument. You are sacrificing something very unique when you do that. The US isn't just a country like any other. It's the embodiment of an ideal. It was forged out of a dream of liberty. And to the extent that you become just like anywhere else, centralized, overregulated, with a powerful and remote government, you will make yourself less American, and by less American I mean less prosperous and less democratic and less free. And that's everybody's problem. It's not just yours, because a strong and engaged America is in the interests of the free world.
You've been highly critical of your publicly funded healthcare system, the National Health Service as it's called. Yet this is the direction liberals like President Obama and some congressmen like Barney Frank and Jana Schakowsky want to take this country in. Please explain why they're so wrong in your view.
Well, governments don't run things very well. They weren't very good at running airlines, they weren't very good at installing telephones, and they're not very good at operating hospitals. You can infer that from the data. I mean, of course, there are good and bad things in all systems. You have horror stories in private hospitals, you have wonderful people in state-run hospitals. But if you look at the empirical data, Britain is almost the last place in the industrialized world where you would want to have cancer or heart disease or stroke. On the measurable evidence, we're worse off on waiting times, on survival rates, and so on. And that's not because of the people who work for the system, many of whom are the most hardworking, generous, motivated of individuals. It's because they're in a system that doesn't maximize their potential. And when I see the US going down this line, I kind of want to warn you that you're not going to find it easy to turn back, because once the government assumes political responsibility for healthcare, it's almost impossible for any politician to argue either for a serious overhaul of the system or for anything other than an exponential rise in the budget.
Let's talk about the reckless spending of the U.S. Congress. You've seen it in your country. What eventually does it result in?
Well, eventually a country that is borrowing without producing goes bankrupt. I am horrified to see now the Fed here declaring that inflation is its objective. I mean, actually coming out and saying as a matter of policy that they support inflation as a way of getting rid of the government debt. In other words, in order to get the administration out of a hole of its own digging, they will further plunder the private savings of individuals. Similar things have happened in other countries. You have to live within your means. You don't cure the patient by giving him more of the poison that made him ill in the first place. You can't borrow your way out of debt. You can't spend your way out of recession. And in the rest of the world, people have now realized this, have drawn back from the brink, have tried to reduce their deficits. The US, which is really extraordinary, when you think of the history of this country, you think of the foundational principles that underlay the sublime constitution here, is now the one that is getting more and more indebted, is drawing more and more power from states and individuals into the federal center.
In the book, you talk a lot about the Tea Party. You seem impressed by folks involved in the movement. What is the impact of the Tea Party, do you think? And do you see a similar thing happening perhaps in England?
I mean, I think that the Tea Party, in a way, is the purest expression of what made the US unique. Here is a country, if you like, born out of a spontaneous popular rising against a high spending and remote government. And here we see something which is very true to that ideal. These are the modern Sons of Liberty, if you like. We don't have foreign equivalents, but I don't think it's because taxes are popular. There was a big survey by the BBC World Service the day before yesterday, 22 countries around the world, and in 21 of those 22 countries, people wanted to have spending cuts rather than tax rises. Okay, so American public opinion is in tune with public opinion in Britain and Brazil and Pakistan and everywhere else. The difference here is the political system, which allows you to ensure that politicians reflect those views. In particular, what is really unique and special about American politics is open primaries. In other countries, people are accustomed to having political candidates, if you like, handed down by the parties, imposed on them by the party selectorates. And so when push comes to shove, they expect their politicians to back the party rather than their local constituents. And that has made people very cynical. It's made them feel taken for granted, ignored. They're accustomed to being disregarded. And that's why it's very difficult to persuade them to join popular movements of a Tea Party kind, because they think it'll be useless. They think the politicians will ignore them and carry on regardless.
If you could have the attention of every single American voter regarding our fast approaching midterm elections, what would you tell them?
Well, I mean, that's not up to me, is it? That was settled at Yorktown. Just as a friend and admirer of the US and a supporter of American democracy, I would say that vote for people who will respect the principles of your constitution, people who understand the sublime nature of the founding doctrines of this country, including the idea of self-reliance, the great Republican virtue that we look to ourselves for solutions, we don't expect other people to come to our aid. Look for candidates who understand the importance of living within your means, of fiscal conservatism, of not spending more than you're earning, and look for candidates in all parties who will respect the principle of the diffusion of power, of states' rights, of localism, of taking decisions as closely as possible to the people that they affect.
You mentioned your government. The new British government is certainly a strange coalition of different parties. They're talking about making massive cuts in the budget. Do you think that will happen, and is it a good idea?
It had to happen. I mean, we inherited a situation where our national debt is rising at £6,000 a second. We took over from a government that had borrowed more in 3 years than had been borrowed by every previous government since the national debt had been instituted in 1694. So in a way, there was no choice about reducing the deficit. I mean, it was either that or total national catastrophe and bankruptcy. There are, of course, a couple of exceptions. As I said, we preserved the healthcare budget because it's politically impossible to do anything else. And of course, our contributions to the European Union are increasing because although every individual member state of the EU is reducing spending, the EU as a whole keeps increasing its budget because it's that much more remote, that much more cut off from voters, and it can get away with that. But I have to say I've been very impressed by the general direction taken by the new coalition government in the UK, not only in terms of cutting spending, but in terms of trying to democratise the system, getting rid of these unaccountable government agencies, trying to pass more powers down to local government, trying to get people off welfare and into work, trying to put parents in charge of schools. I think this is a great reforming ministry, and I hope it'll succeed, and I'm confident that it'll be re-elected on the basis of its record.
Now, the new government's also talking a lot about green policies, including reducing the number of runways at Heathrow to limit carbon emissions. Do you think this is a good policy decision?
Well, look, yes, I've just spoken in favour of localism, and Heathrow is part of the region that I represent. There is almost nobody at Heathrow, other than those with a direct and immediate financial stake in it, who wants the third runway. The local people are almost unanimously against, as are people in the surrounding area. I was very impressed that the new government stood up to some very powerful corporate lobbying from a couple of big multinational corporations and did what local people want. I think it's not quite right to see this just as a green issue. This is a democratic issue, and there were people of left, right and centre who thought that the excessive concentration of population in one part of the UK is leading to overcrowding, to a diminution in the quality of life, and that we should try and spread out development more fairly.
And finally, there were reports that the euro is fragile. Do you see a danger of the euro collapsing?
No, I see a danger of the euro surviving. The best possible thing that can happen to Europe now is that they would end this nonsense of trying to impose uniform interest rates and uniform monetary policy across the whole continent. Spain, Greece, Italy, the other countries that are struggling now with deflation and stagnation, they should be allowed to price themselves into the market. The best possible boost they could get would be a competitive devaluation that would allow them to sell their goods more competitively. And which would also, of course, get the other countries, the northern countries, off the hook of having to underwrite their debts and bail them out. So, in a way, the tragedy of Europe is not that the euro might break apart, but that it's going to survive and condemn the peoples of the Mediterranean to generations of enforced emigration and the taxpayers of northern Europe to bailout after bailout.
Daniel Hannan, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, sir.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching Newsmax TV.